Welcome to the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. I'm Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. This podcast is a ministry of the Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, where I pastor here in Palo Alto, California. Now let's dive in to our next episode. On today's episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, I have the pleasure of chatting with Pastor Karl Vaters. Karl Vaters has served in small church ministry for over 40 years. Karl hosts a podcast called The Church Lobby Conversations on Faith and Ministry. He's the author of 5 books, including Small Church Essentials and the newly released De-Sizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. He's married to Shelley and has 3 children and 2 grandkids. Karl, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Oh, you're welcome, Travis. It's good to be with you.
As we get started, I love to ask people, what has your faith journey been like? What were the formative religious influences of your upbringing that has led you to where you're at today?
Oh, boy, I am a third generation pastor. So I am a preacher's kid who was raised by a preacher's kid who raised preacher's kids. So so I was literally born on a Sunday while my dad was preaching a Sunday morning sermon. He dropped my
Oh,
mom off at the hospital. Yeah, tiny little town with a one-bed, hospital. I mean, tiny, tiny. He dropped my mom off. They said, "She's gonna be hours. Don't worry about it." And this was back in the day when dads weren't in the delivery room anyway. And they said, "Go do what you need to do." And it was Sunday night, and they had Sunday night service. He went, he preached, he came back, and there I was. So I was literally born while my dad was preaching. And then the next Sunday, I sat in the bassinet on the piano bench while my mom played the piano. So, yeah,
they
the
they were a classic pastor and pastor's wife duo of the pastor preaching and the wife playing
yep,
piano.
yeah, oh yeah, very, very much so. So that was my background, and came to know, came to faith in Christ, very early on when I was 6 or 7. I remember the day that it was at a kids, one of these little kids meetings that they had. The grown-ups had their guest speaker evangelist come in, and they had a thing for kids, and they gave an altar call, and when he gave the call to salvation, he said, your parents might be Christians, your parents might even be leaders in the church, your parents might even be the pastor of this church. I don't know, but you still need to make that decision for Christ by yourself. And I went, oh yeah, I haven't done that, and I'm literally just 6 or 7. So I went, oh, okay. So I made that decision, and I have, had ups and downs along the way, but I've never strayed from faith, even though I've often challenged it. And then I did push back against the pastoral calling because third generation pastor, and I knew you can't go into being a pastor because it's the family business. That's not how that works. So I really pushed back against it because I was thinking, I'm just feeling a draw to that because this is what the family does. And every other thing I tried, everything other thing I tested just fell flat. And so I finally just surrendered and said, okay, Lord, if this is it, then actually what I did was I had a speech class. I was always terrified to talk in front of groups. And I had a speech class at junior college. And I said, I'm signing up for this speech class. And if I can't get through this class and speak to a group, then that's proof that I'm not called to pastoral ministry. And Lord, you're going to have to find something else for me to do. And I got up on that first speech, I was terrified out of my mind. And the moment I started speaking, I went, "This is the easiest thing in the world." And and at the end of it, the speech teacher actually handed me a note, said, "Please talk to me about competitive speech." I went, "Okay, I guess not only am I not nervous about this, but I guess I'm good at it." So this is the Lord saying, "Yeah, this is a confirmation of that call." I knew then, and I know now that pastoring is not just about preaching, but I knew that that was a big roadblock that I had to overcome, and that the Lord helped me overcome. So, yeah, that's kind of how I ended up, knowing the Lord and being in ministry.
So what I find interesting about that is that you were kind of trying other possible vocations, not
Mhm.
because you didn't like the idea of being a pastor, but you just didn't want to do it because you were following in your dad's footsteps. Whereas
Yeah.
I hear a lot of pastors who felt they had a call, but they were like, no, the last thing I want to do is be a pastor. But it was different for you. You had
Yeah.
an interest in this at a young age.
Yeah, yeah, pastoring was very, very natural to me. In fact, that was part of the thing was I had so many others, people confirming, "Oh, you're gonna be a pastor." But they would always say, "You're gonna be a pastor like your dad." And if they
Mm,
just left those last 3 words off of it, I probably would have found it easier to accept. Now, I there's nobody on earth I admire more than my dad. My dad was, the most amazing pastor and the most amazing father. So, if there's anybody in the world I want to be like, it's my dad. So, it's not about pushing back against dad. It's about an understanding that that's not the reason to go into the pastorate. But so I always that was always the call. That was always the evidence in my life that I was called to be some kind of a spiritual leader, pastor, whatever. But
mm.
yeah, that was if he hadn't been a pastor, or if they hadn't had those last 3 words when they confirmed my call, it probably wouldn't have been. It wasn't that long a fight. When you're in your teens, fighting against something for 6 months, it feels like an eternity. But it was probably a couple years where I really pushed back against it before I finally gave into it.
Do you find that your style of pastoring is similar to how you perceived your dad's style of pastoring was?
In some ways, yes, but in other ways, quite different. My dad was, both of us are good preachers and teachers. We're both good with people, and people tend to like us. We're likable, I guess.
Hmm.
But he is far better at the administration and finance, and he's the guy. He could pastor. He did, in fact, pastor churches of 4, 5, 600 people and more, and seemed to know absolutely everybody's name. Like in a lot of the ministry that I do with small church pastors, I tell everybody has a capacity of like 150 people. That's all you can even know the names of. But somehow my dad knew, somehow he had this capacity to be able to do that. And I don't remember names well. I mean, beyond a friendship of circle of 50 people, it's like, who are they again? So, but yeah, often when I'm preaching, I will catch myself, and often I'll look down at my wife, and now my dad and mom attend the church as well. Every once in a while, I look down at them, and I'll see my mom kind of with a snicker on the side of her face, going, "You just did an Albert right there." Like I can hear my dad's voice coming through me occasionally. So, and that's there's no negative in that whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that is a gift, and to be able to thank God that passing down that gift of pastoring from generation to generation, and to see that's working to the point that now you are pastoring your dad in a way.
Yeah.
That's very unique. So, man, that's fantastic.
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
So what's with this passion for small churches? You have written extensively about small churches. You've become the go-to guy when it comes to doing small church ministries. But don't most Christians in America think bigger is better?
Yes, and yes. Yeah, we do. We've got this bigger is better mindset, which is we'll get to is the point of the new book. But no, I came to be the small church expert, for lack of a better word, or at least the small church go-to guy, because I tried and failed to build a big church.
Hmm.
I did. I'm here in Orange County, California. So we've got all these internationally renowned mega churches that started movements all around us, from Calvary Chapel to Vineyard to Crystal Cathedral, Saddleback Church, Church on the Way, Angelus Temple. I mean, it's crazy the big movements that have begun within just a few miles of my front door here. And so when we landed here 31 years ago, that right in the heyday of the church growth movement, I thought, hey, well, we'll do the principles that they're telling me to do, and our church will get big too. After all, look at all the people that are around here. I just never could get the place big. It the stuff I did everything right, and nothing. I had experts come in and assess our Sunday morning services, and they'd walk away going, "Oh, you won't be small for long. You're doing everything you should." And it just never, to the point where I almost left ministry thinking I must be doing something wrong and not being aware of it. And I had to come to a real change of heart and change of mind and change of paradigm to understand that doing good ministry does not necessarily mean uh, a continual numerical increase. I call it now the myth of inevitability. There is no inevitability to numerical increase, no matter how many of the right things you do. And then I started looking around and realizing there's a whole bunch of small churches out here that are doing really good, very healthy, very good ministry. And they may have had some numerical growth, but a whole lot of them seem to get to what I now call a shoe size, where this is just the size that tends to work best for us and the size at which we do our best work for the kingdom of God. And out of that, I decided, okay, I'm going to figure out how to change my mindset on this. And I'm going to see what I can do to discover or create the best possible resources for small churches, because there's a whole lot of us who have been sitting under this burden that we must increase numerically in order to validate our ministry. And I've come to the realization that numerical increase is not the way to validate that. And we've got to recognize the value of small.
So tell me a bit more about that moment when you felt like you wanted to quit ministry because of how discouraged you felt about the numbers not going up. Was that because of internal pressure coming from yourself or external pressure coming from the congregation? Or, yeah, just talk a bit about that.
It was internal from me, and it was external, but not from the congregation. The external was from denominational leaders and from church growth leaders and from the books and conferences I was reading and going to. So I internally felt like, okay, if I'm not getting bigger, I must be doing something wrong. And then that was validated. Those wrong feelings were validated every time I talked to other pastors, every time I went to a conference, every time I read a church growth book. They all insisted, if you're not growing numerically, there's something you're not doing right. There's some obstacle that you've put in the way. And if you remove that obstacle, then magically things will just start getting bigger. So yeah, it was internal, and it was motivated and reinforced by external components. But the one external component that was not there was the church congregation members themselves were never pushing for numerical increase. When they got behind me when I came up with ideas for numerical increase, they supported me, they blessed me, they tried to get there, but nobody was thinking, hey, we don't like the church because it's not big enough. So that was the one place the pressure did not come from, which is one of the big reasons why I'm still at this church after 31 years, because they stood beside me going through a whole bunch of real soul searching and questioning, and really were a great support to me and to our family and to our entire pastoral team here for a whole lot of years.
And I assume when you first started 31 years ago, you were a little bit of a younger person. And
Yeah.
and one thing I hear a lot at churches is they want to hire a young pastor so that they can bring in young families so that they can grow the church. And yet, in your experience, that wasn't enough.
No, no. I was 31, 31, 32 when I actually, it was my 33rd birthday that I first preached at this church. So I was 32 when I was going through the process, and and I came in with 3 generations worth of experience, and like, so I was coming in at 33, but I had 33 years of ministry experience. I mean, literally, these things that you learn as you're watching your dad when you're 7, when you're 12, they are a big part of that. So there was that, but I also had a desire to learn new things and do things in a fresh new way. So I wasn't coming in like with an old school insistence either. That wasn't the problem. I had a lot of experience, but I also had a real innovative heart. So that combination in a place like Orange County, at a church that's on a major street that has tens of thousands of people go by in the cars every single day, you combine those things together, and there's no reason why this should not have meant massive numerical increase. All the pieces were, and a willing congregation that was willing to try all kinds of new and innovative stuff. I look around, even looking back today, and going, there were no pieces missing. There's no. I can't look back and say, oh, that's the reason why, because of this roadblock. There were no roadblocks. It was all positive forward momentum. and the numbers just wouldn't go up. Now they went up somewhat. I showed up to a church that had 20, and we've landed at about 150 to 200 as what seems to be our best workable size. So that's almost a tenfold increase, which is pretty significant. But that took 20 years to happen, and it didn't get any bigger than that. Whereas that's why even 200 and under is still considered a small church, according to most church growth experts. So yeah, young and innovative is not enough, and I think that's because getting bigger is not the point, and it shouldn't be the point. Sometimes it's a byproduct, but not always.
You mentioned a number of conferences and books and speakers, and they're all saying you've got to do this, this, and this to make a bigger church, make your church grow. And that reminds me of my seminary professor who taught preaching. He would always say, don't preach a sermon that is telling people, this is what's wrong with your life, that is what's wrong with your life, that is what's wrong with your life, because they don't need to be told constantly how uh, terrible their lives are, because they already know it. They already know all the things that are problematic. What they need to hear is the grace of Jesus Christ, that
Hmm.
he came to live obediently, perfectly for them and to die for them. And when I hear speakers talk about what a church should be and what a pastor needs to do, it can feel like I'm getting told, oh, that's another thing that's wrong with you.
Mm.
Do you relate to that?
Yeah, very much so. Especially because almost all of those voices that we're listening to are coming from very large churches. Now, I'm pro big church. I'm pro small church. I'm not against any size of church. So this is not a put down of the big church. But when you are hearing from the big church, then you're hearing it from a big church perspective, and so they are going to describe what worked in their church and what currently works in their church. And then if we try to do that in a smaller context, we begin to discover it doesn't work. And then we look around and we go, okay, are they wrong in what they're suggesting, or am I stupid in the way I'm implementing it? Right? It seems like it's got to be one or the other. And the good news is they're not wrong, and you're not stupid. And I had to come to that realization. They're not saying anything that's bad here, and I'm not stupid in my attempts to duplicate it. It's just simply not designed for my size. So this idea of taking what someone else is doing and trying to duplicate it typically doesn't work. One, because God doesn't franchise things like that, but two, because most of the stuff that we get is coming from a big church standpoint, and it simply doesn't overlap with a whole lot of what God is calling most churches to do.
Hmm. Yeah, you make that really clear in your new book about that you're not pro small church and anti big church. You really welcome all size churches, and I really appreciated that the size isn't necessarily the problem. But you do say in your book, you say the pursuit of bigness in the church is morally, theologically, and emotionally damaging. What's the
Mhm.
difference between talking about the pursuit of bigness and just a big church?
Yeah. Bigness is a mindset. So getting bigger is not a problem, but pursuing bigness, making the pursuit of size one of your primary goals, or in some cases, your exclusive goal, that is a toxic and dangerous mindset. Because at that point, we're really coming to the point where we're making an idol of size, where now all of a sudden getting bigger is everything. And it gets to the point where we often, we've all seen it if we paid attention to it, how many times a a morally or theologically compromised church is excused because, well, look at the numbers, they must be doing something right. Look at how God is blessing. The numbers are up, so they must be doing good theology. They must not be morally compromised. There was a recent, one of how many we've had recently, documentaries about somebody who was in a toxic church situation, and it's actually a YouTube video about experiences that Matt Redman went through when he was in his early ministry and some of the toxic situations he was in. And I counted in a half-hour documentary about a toxic church situation, 11 times in half an hour, different speakers mentioned, well, we couldn't oppose it because look at the numbers. Look at how many people were coming. Look at the way the Lord was blessing. Look at all the salvations. And 11 times the rising numbers blocked people from taking moral accountability for what was happening. So that to me that's what bigness is about. Bigness is when we put numerical pursuit ahead of biblical integrity. And when you do that, it causes all kinds of problems.
It runs into the age-old problem of the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
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 Well, tell me a bit about the church growth movement. For many of our listeners, they may have heard that term, but don't know a lot about it. And when I was reading your book, I even though I've been to seminary, went to Bible college, I didn't realize how little I knew about it. And so I was wondering if you could just take us back a little bit through the history of the church growth movement.
Yeah, let's take a few minutes for that. It will take a little bit. So for your listeners, just hang in there. It'll take a little longer than usual, but
Sure.
it's a really fascinating story that I think will be very helpful. So, you've read the book, so you've seen this, and you know that none of the claims that I make about the church growth movement in the book are new, but I put pieces together that I don't know that anybody's put together before. So it's not that there's no new facts, but there's a new way of organizing that I think gives us some insight, and that's the hope. So I looked around and I saw this, obsession with bigness in America, and I started asking myself about 2.5 years ago, okay, so where did this come from? Because nothing comes from nowhere. Everything comes from somewhere. And if we're obsessed with bigness, that isn't necessarily a natural human state. It comes from somewhere. So I thought, let me do some research to see if I can figure out where it came from. And it led to a deep dive into the church growth movement, which led into a deep dive into American history. So here's the basic premise of it. There wasn't one church growth movement. It turns out there were actually two. And most people aren't aware that there were two until it's described. And then they go, oh, of course, which is what happened to me. So the church growth movement that most church leadership experts are aware of began with a man named Donald McGavran. And Donald McGavran was a missionary to India, and he was decades in India. And near the end of his time in India, he started hearing about entire villages that were coming to faith in Christ. And he went to these villages and discovered that it was true. Entire villages were coming to faith in Christ. So he thought, I'm going to study this and I'm going to research this and I'm going to discover, are there underlying scriptural principles that we can learn from so that we can take these principles and see if there might be other places where we can help people, movements come to Christ. And he did the study of that. And then when he retired, he did a short tour through Africa, a couple African nations where similar things were happening. Then he came home and he wrote it all up in a book that he titled The Bridges of God. And The Bridges of God came out in the late 50s, early 60s. And it is, by every estimate, the first book in what's called the church growth movement. In fact, it's the first place in which the term church growth ever appeared in print. And a lot of what we now take for granted in the church growth movement, he started in that book. And then in 1967, he started the Church Growth Institute in Fuller University, not far from where I am here right now in Southern California. And for the first 7 years, when he taught the class, he wouldn't allow American pastors to take the class. Now, he couldn't just say no American pastors allowed. People got upset about that. So what he did was he had 3 requirements. You have to speak a second language other than English. You have to have spent some time in a missions context outside of America, and third, you have to show that you have an expertise in another indigenous people group outside of your own. And when you do that, you exclude 99.9% of American pastors. So he was basically teaching pastors from other countries. But he had written his book, The Bridges of God, and American pastors were reading it and going, we want more. Please let us in the class. And so finally, after 7 years of teaching it, when he was 67 years of age, he relented and he taught the first church growth class at Fuller in 1972. There were only about 20 or 25 people who attended that class, but that is considered the absolute spark point, the turning moment, the pivot point for the church growth movement in America. And all that we know about church growth comes from that standpoint. But as I'm reading through this, I'm getting to the point where I'm going, okay, why was it that he didn't want American pastors in the class? There's something to this. So I did the deep dive into American history, and here's what I discovered. You've got the McGavran church growth stream, but now you've got the American church growth stream, which was much bigger than McGavran's and which preceded it by a couple hundred years. So here's what you got. Um, America is established, and um, one of the unintended consequences of some of America's best ideas was that we're obsessed with size. And here's where it comes from in the church world. So some of America's best ideas are, for instance, the First Amendment to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. I mean, these are America's best ideas. And they were written by people who came from Northern European countries where they had state churches, state-run churches. And they didn't want a state-run church, and appropriately so. But when you have a state-run church, then when the state collects taxes, the state also collects tithes, and they distribute through the tax base, they distribute that money to the state churches. So in Europe, if you were a pastor pastoring a church, you didn't have to get much in the offering because once a month you were handed a check by the government that paid your salary and kept the upkeep of the church. Now you come to America, you can believe what you want, but we ain't paying for it. So if you want to be able to have your church grow, if you want to move forward with things, you've got to draw a big enough crowd to get a big enough offering to pay your salary to build a building. And at that point, the entrepreneurial pastor is born. So that's why the church growth movement, even though McGavran discovered the seeds of his ideas in India and Africa, he brings it to America, and his new ideas that are really quite brilliant join into this pre-existing American stream of the entrepreneurial pastor. And the reason McGavran resisted bringing American pastors into it is his whole point was he wanted to see people movements come to Christ. He wanted to go to a region and see the percentage of Christians in that town increase. And he thought, but if they get my ideas, American pastors are going to turn it into a big church contest. It's going to be about how to make my church bigger. And sure enough, that's what we've done with it. We've turned it into this big church contest. And we blamed McGavran for a lot of these things that he in fact fought against. So that's a really quick overview of what takes 2 or 3 chapters to go over in my book. And I didn't even get into the whole rise of the suburbs and how that's influenced our theology and our architecture and everything else, and how that's all fed into it. But that's the basic idea of it. You got these 2 streams blending into some very weird ways.
When you said entrepreneurial, like when the pastor became an entrepreneur, that kind of makes me think of, is that when the church became a business?
Mm,
You know, it because of that language. And I live here in Silicon Valley, where founders and entrepreneurs are a dime a dozen. They're all my
yeah.
neighbors and everywhere around me. And but I have thought about this before, where there is a lot of connections between the church planter and the tech founder.
Mm,
And I've seen that where a church planner has all of these ideas, all this ideas about how to create a church and grow the church really fast and create this whole system. Um, and that's a very different way of thinking about church, it seems, than what was done for centuries before.
yeah, that's very true. Now, for centuries before, the church was far from perfect. For
Hmm.
most of European history, for instance, there was way too strong a wedding between the church and the state. And in many, I mean, how many, we had a string of there was a string of how many popes who held the strongest political power throughout the entire known world at the time. So they were not innocent, but so it was mostly a wedding of politics with faith in Europe, but it became business with faith in America, because the First Amendment disunited the state from the church, but it did not disconnect business from the church. And in fact, it kind of brought them together in a whole lot of ways. So yeah, the entrepreneur pastor is a big part of what we're all about. And all you need to do is take a look around the last 20 from in the 1990s and O's especially. There was a huge glut of speakers and books that applied entrepreneurial principles to the pastorate, and you can find them all over the place. Some of the most popular leadership books of that era were about that. I can't tell you how many times in the O's, particularly the Jim Collins's book Good to Great became a huge book, and it's not even about the church. It's entrepreneurial. How did good companies become great companies? It's all about entrepreneurialism. And it's actually a very good book. I enjoyed it very much. And how many times I would hear two main principles come from that book. One, you got to get the right people on the bus. So it's about hiring, the right people. And two, the big, hairy, audacious goal. Just this past week, at a conference, somebody referenced, you got to have a big, hairy, audacious goal. That's straight from Jim Collins, Good to Great, not an unchristian book, but not a Christian book,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so many of us have taken our lead from entrepreneurial ideas rather than from scripture. And there are times in which we can see an entrepreneurial approach in the early church. They did some very innovative things and some very new things and some very fresh things. But if you're taking an entrepreneurial approach as your primary, then you're being led if innovation follows the gospel, that's fine. But if the gospel is being led by entrepreneurialism, you got a problem.
That's a great way to put it. You have to focus first on the gospel, and the
Yeah,
gospel leads the way.
yeah,
Yeah, we so often mix that up, not only in how we operate in church, but how we operate in our relationships, how we operate in so many aspects of our lives, is that we think there's other things that need to get the cart rolling, so to speak, when really we need to come back to the basics of the gospel.
yeah,
So, my church here in Palo Alto is a relatively small church, and I imagine people who will listen to this podcast are members of small churches. What encouragement do you have for small churches in United States today? What do you emphasize with your listeners and those you're teaching about the value and the goodness of and the strengths of small churches?
yeah. The main thing that I always start with is I try to encourage and help us with a change of mindset. The size of your church is not an indication of the value of your church and of your ministry. We have got to disconnect size from value. There is no indicator in Scripture that, in fact, if you take a look at in Revelation, right, the seven churches that the Book of Revelation is written to, it was the bigger, wealthier churches that got the negative word, and it was the smaller, struggling churches that got the positive word. So the idea that somehow bigger means better, it just simply doesn't match the thrust of Scripture, first of all. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if you take a look around the world and you see how God is working around the world where Christians are, as we mentioned earlier, increasing as a percentage of the population. One of the principles that Donald McGavran discovered and that still holds true today is that in the places where Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population, it's almost exclusively because healthy small churches are multiplying and thriving, not because churches are getting bigger. In places where churches are getting bigger, it's typically not because Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population. In places where churches are getting bigger, it's typically because that's where Christians have money. Now, that's not a negative. If you've got the funds and you're able to build a big ministry, that's great. There are positives to big ministry. But the size of the ministry has never been an evidence of a rising spiritual tide in a location. Here I am in Orange County, California. All these big major churches around me that have been a blessing to our county and have been a blessing to the world all around me. And they've all popped up in the last 40 years or so. But I can tell you, in the last 40 years or so, my county has not become a more holy place. We've got bigger churches, but we have fewer Christians because this is not a place where Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population. Orange County is a place where the Christians have some cash. And so a lot of what we call church growth is actually Christian consolidation. So to the healthy small church and to those who are serving in healthy small churches, let me say this: the small church has been and remains the primary engine driving the growth of the global church. When Jesus said, I will build my church, he didn't say your church has to get bigger in order to participate in the building of our church. Your small church is not a problem to fix. Your small church is a part of God's strategy, and we've got to see it that way.
Hmm. What do you think are the marks of a healthy church? If we got to get size out of the equation, what what is left? What is in the equation for a healthy church?
Yeah, that's actually something I tackled directly in desizing the church. In fact, the appendix in the appendix to it, I put in what I call the church health assessment tool. And what I did was, because I get this question a lot and I wanted to make the answer very practical. So in the appendix, the church health assessment tool, what I do is I give 16 different principles on, so 4 different principles under 4 different subheadings. So under theology, attitude. Where is it here? I got to look up what I wrote here. Under theology, leadership, mission, and attitude, those are the main categories. And then under each one of them, there are subcategories. So here are some of the things, for instance. I'll say under theology, the first question is about the Bible. The eternal truths of the Bible are taught well and applied to our lives in a practical way. Would you give your church a 0 on that? No, we're doing that terribly. A 5 on that? We're doing that awesomely, or somewhere in the middle. And then under worship, under salvation, under leadership, under teamwork. Here's one, for instance, under outreach. Congregation members feel good about telling their friends about the church and inviting them to attend. Right? Yes, we do that awesome. 0, no, we do that terrible, or somewhere in the middle. And there's 16 of these basically markers of church health that are non-numerical, that you can take, that you can give yourself an assessment. My hope is that within a year or so, we're working towards this. My hope is that at some point, I want to be able to put those 16 points online where a pastor can put a QR code on their screen, can ask everybody in the congregation, scan the QR code, and in 5 minutes, I want you to take this survey yourself. So that pastor then can then get a readout from the entire congregation and get feedback from the congregation about these are the things we're doing well. We're great at Bible teaching, but we're really terrible at welcoming newcomers. Or we're awesome at discipleship, but we're really not very good at fellowship. Those kinds of things. So it helps to define some of these basic things. And if you go through the list, if you read through it, you go, oh, this is just basic Christian living and basic church life. But we've laid that aside over the last couple of decades, 4 or 5 decades actually, in favor of numerical markers and metrics, as though everything can and should be measured. But not everything can be measured and not everything should be measured, at least not numerically. So we've got to start coming up with different ways to understand what church health looks like.
I think that's really wonderful because I was looking at that assessment tool yesterday, and one of the things that comes to my mind is that it helps churches to name reality, to
Mhm.
name their strengths and to name their weaknesses, and
Mm.
not to spend all this time wallowing about, oh, if we only had 10 more members, if we only had 30 more members, we would be an amazing church. It gets rid of that temptation. It just says, focus on what you really are.
Yeah.
Because what I've found in our small church is the people that show up on Sundays, not just our members, but visitors, they are people who are specifically looking for a smaller church.
Yes.
And I remember talking to one of our members, and he said to me, oh, I would hope we would never become a big church, because he sees the strength of the community and knowing everyone as being vital to his spiritual health and well-being.
Absolutely.
And I think this assessment can really help churches to begin to name those strengths. Sometimes that's all we need, just to be reminded that, hey,
Yeah.
we're actually doing some really good things.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. One of the big church growth and health tools in the 1990s was Natural Church Development by Christian Schwartz. And he had a lot of really good stuff in there. And I really appreciated a lot of what he did because he went deeper than just simply how many people you got in sitting on Sunday morning. But his premise was, okay, here are these, I think it was 8 different areas of health that every church should have. And you assess them kind of like I just did there. But then his point was find the lowest one and strengthen it so that it's a little higher because the water will only flow up as high as your lowest marker, right? But what a lot of churches discovered by doing that was when they're concentrating on their weaknesses, they live in a place of constant discouragement.
Mm.
And especially now in a bigger church where you've got a lot of people and you've got staff and you can work on those things, that's okay. But in a smaller church where all you're doing is concentrating on the negatives, you can really get discouraged and it can pull the whole church's attitude down. Better, and the smaller the church is, the more this is true. Better to capitalize on your strengths. The smaller your church is, the more simplified your mission should be, the more singular your focus should be, and don't worry about the stuff you don't do well. Jesus is building his church and he'll make sure some other church gets that taken care of. You do well what you do well. So rabbits gotta hop and birds gotta fly and fish gotta swim, and quit giving the fish flying lessons because that's never going to work.
I love that. Well, one last question as we wrap up. Um, as you wrote this book, what are 1, 2, or 3 resources that you came across, whether they were books or podcasts or um, documentaries, that you found was really helpful for writing this book about desizing the church?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. One place to, if anybody wants to explore this any further, my podcast happens to be called The Church Lobby, as you mentioned earlier. And right now, I'm in the middle of a series where I'm actually interviewing some of the authors that I referenced in the book.
Hmm.
So I can mention some of them. Caitlin Beatty wrote a great book called Celebrities for Jesus. And it's a really good breakdown of our celebrity culture, where it came from, why it's dangerous, and how to do some better things moving forward. So she was a huge help to me on that. Scott McKnight, A Church Called Tove. He'll be on the podcast in I think beginning of mid May maybe. And his was about bringing a goodness culture back into the church and staying away from our obsession with numbers that at times calls us to compromise on our values. So those were 2 really, really big helpers. And I'm trying to think, there was a third one. I mean, Donald McGavran's biography was a big help for me in writing this book. It's not going to be as widely applicable to others as these other ones were. Oh, the other one was, and this is a hefty one, The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald.
Mhm.
It is like a 1,300 page thump of a book. But she goes through from a clinical standpoint. I think she was like a writer for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times or something. So she's coming from a very clinical, historical standpoint, and she walks through the entire history of evangelicalism in America. And she does not have an axe to grind, but she touches on everything. So anybody who's really interested in the history of evangelicalism in America, I'm just warning you, it is a monster of a book to get through. But if you're a reader and you want to go deep, that's a huge book. That was a really helpful book for me.
That's great. I actually, when I came across that book and you were referencing it, I threw it on my Amazon wish list, and I did see the page number, and I thought, yeah, that's a big commitment, but I really do think that would be a really fascinating read.
Yeah, it's a
Well,
monster.
Karl, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This has just been such an encouraging conversation for me as a pastor of a small church, and I'm sure for many of our listeners as well. And I just wish you all the very best as you continue this ministry. It's just so vital in our culture today, especially with so many pastors are discouraged, so many churches are discouraged. COVID was just uh, wrecked a lot of churches, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of reasons churches are struggling today. And I think you are one voice that brings a great encouragement to the church. So thank you for your ministry.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you for having me on. And I pray God's bless for this podcast and for your congregation going forward as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for the Faith Informing Podcast. If you're interested in hearing more great conversations like the one you just heard, be sure to like, follow, or subscribe to our podcast on YouTube or Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners, and if you want to reach out, email me at pastor@pacrc.org.